Okay, everyone. Well, I think we're going to get started here today. So thank you for joining us for the mental aspects of returning to train, what to expect in the unexpected here today. My name is Kara Button, and I am the Game Plan Advisor at the Canadian Sport Institute in Calgary. So your microphones are all muted, and they will remain that way. At the end of this session, there will be an opportunity for some Q&A. So any questions you have that come up along the way, if you just put them in the Q&A, we'll make sure that they get answered. If they don't get answered during this session, we'll do our best to answer them after and make sure you get a response. So I'd like to introduce you to Emily Soulard and Patrick Cote today. They will be doing this presentation. Emily will have a bit of a presentation to start, and then they will have a Q&A between the two of them. Emily is a registered psychologist and lead mental performance consultant at the INS, Institut National du Sport de Québec. She tends to work mainly with boccia and wheelchair rugby, but she also does work with many individual athletes. She is a lecturer at the Université de Sherbrooke, and she works with many athletes and coaches there from all different levels and different sports. Patrick is been with wheelchair rugby for the past 15 years. He's been involved with the sport for the past 15 years, but the last 3 he has been the head coach. He has received a lot of acclaim for his technical understanding of the sport, in addition to his development and use of data analysis for solutions. So I'm sure they are going to have a fun conversation about preparing the athletes for what to expect here as they return to train. So Emily, I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you, Kara. Hello, everyone. Hello, Pat. I'm glad to be with you today and to talk to you a little bit about the returning to training and what to expect in the unexpected. Well, first I'll present the main 3 challenges you coaches and your athletes will face. And you're already facing those challenges. And you'll see that those challenges are linked to the 3 phases of returning to training. And I'll share that with you. And I'll also give you a couple of tips and guidelines, and after that we'll open discussion with Coach Patrick Cote. All right. Up. Oops, sorry. So I'm not going to go over it again. You know that it's what we've been facing with COVID-19 is there's no precedent with that, and we're facing 3 main challenges right now that we're starting to get back to work, get back to training. The first challenge we're facing is the emotions. We have to manage the emotion, the uncertainty, and the insecurity that are associated with losing our bearings, losing what was known, what was controllable. We're in an environment where it's very complex, it's very uncertain right now. And that brings a lot of anxiety. It could bring different types of emotions as well. And part of the challenge is to manage all those emotions. And we'll see a different range, a large range of emotions. The second challenge is to give meaning to the situation we're actually experiencing. And we'll have to explain. Human beings need to give explanation. They need to understand what's happening to them. And giving meaning will be a big part of what you'll do as coaches. You'll help athletes put things into perspective and explain what's happening. The third challenge is to mobilize energy to adapt to this new reality with new rules. We'll have to master new habits, new skills, and we'll have to set new goals or revisit our goals. All those challenges will need to be addressed one at a time, I should say. And that's why it leads to 3 different phases. The first phase of returning to training is what we've called the emotional phase. The emotional phase, because that's the very first session, the very first training you'll do with your athletes. It's a good idea to lower your expectation in terms of work that is going to be done in those very first sessions, because it is going to be emotional. Athletes will need to connect, they'll need to talk, they need to vent, and to talk about what happened in confinement. They'll be happy to see you, coaches. If there are other teammates, they'll be happy to see them, and they'll need to reconnect. So that's the emotional phase. The second phase, we've called it the rational phase, because that will be the decision-making phase. We'll need to reset goals, and we'll need to reset on solid grounds, not on impressions or feelings. We'll need to test. We'll need to know exactly where the athlete is at physically, mentally, technically, strategically, and we'll need to start from there, not from where we want to be, but we'll need to start from where we are really. And then the third phase is the action phase, when we'll put into place the training plan. And there are a couple of challenges in that phase as well, because we're not going to be able to start at the same point. All the athletes will be at different points, and we'll need to put all this together. We'll need to individualize training a lot. So 3 phases with different challenges, of course, and they're not going to necessarily be linear. Some athletes will go through phases very, very quickly. Some of them will have to come back to a previous phase. So we're not going to start at the same time, and then we're not going to be at the same pace going through those different phases of returning to training. All right, so before we go further into those different phases, well, we'd like to know a little bit more about you. So I think we have a first poll question for you. There you go. So we'd like to know where you're located and what is your main responsibility. And we should have answers pretty soon. Here it is. All right, so most of you are from the West, Alberta, British Columbia, Ontario as well. A couple of coaches from Quebec, the Maritimes, right? Even some from overseas. And there you go. Most of you are club coaches, national team coaches, provincial team coaches. Right. Great. Thank you. Perfect. So we'll move on through each phase. And here it is. Okay. So there are a couple of keywords I've put with the phases. And the first one for the emotional phase is the coaches will need to be empathetic. Empathy is the main keyword here. As I said, athletes will need to talk, they need to vent, they need to connect. So the relationships will be very important. In the rational phase, the keyword is realistic. So we'll need to be realistic with our expectations, and we'll need to use reality as a major ground or a main ground to set goals. And finally, the key word for the action phase is resiliency, or you'll need to be resilient as we move on into the training plan. There'll be other obstacles, there'll be ups and downs. We might even go back to change again. So we'll need to adapt again. So resiliency will be really important through the 3 phases, but especially the 3rd phase. All right, so we'll start with the first phase, what we call the emotional phase. And the emotional phase, because you coaches and your athletes, even your staff, will return with very different experiences, different priorities, different fears, different backgrounds. We all had different experiences of confinement. For some of them, it was life as usual. They could train. They had meetings with their coaches, their teammates. So other than being at home, it was almost like a business as usual. For others, it was more difficult. They could be directly impacted with COVID-19, either because I don't know, a grandmother or grandfather passed away, because their partner lost their job, because they had relationship difficulties at home. They had to balance training and family, let's say. So different backgrounds, different challenges, different way of returning to train, of course. So they'll go through a whole range of emotion, but I identified 4 different emotions, 4 examples of mindset they could return to. The first one is the happy to be back mindset. I would say most of athletes, and even you coaches, most of us will be happy to be back, because we're happy to be back to what we love, and that's perfect. The challenge here is not to go too fast. You'll hear me talk about progressive, going slowly, and that will be very important to avoid injuries and overtraining. But most of us will be very happy to be back. I would say about 80% of us. There'll be a small percentage of us who will be resistant to return. Maybe because we've had negative experiences with COVID, maybe because we fear either getting sick, or we fear we might feel that we're not up to expectations. So there might be resistance to return to training, and that's important to consider. And that's true for your athletes, but also true for you coaches. You might find yourself a little bit resistant to come back for many different reasons. Another reaction is to be indifferent or careless about the return or about the whole situation. And that's somewhat of a danger, because if I think, well, that's not important, let's go back to the usual, we might put ourselves at risk or put others at risk. So that's an example of behaviors we could see. And finally, we will have athletes or self-coaches and staff could be directly impacted by COVID. As I mentioned, we might have lost a member of a family, we might have lost our job. So that could be something to consider and be very empathetic with as well. So in that very first phase, the emotional phase, of course, coaches, you'll need to be prepared to listen. Listen to the words, listen to the stories, listen to experiences, but also pay attention to body language. That will tell you a lot about either your athlete is happy to be back and wanting to train and maybe at risk of overdoing it, or if your athlete is resistant to change or careless about the rules and things like that. So body language, the verbal and non-verbal communication will be very important. It will be especially true for the very beginning, the very first sessions you'll have. Offer space and time to reconnect, to talk, to have fun. Don't expect to be very productive right away. It will take some time to build that connection, to build that solidarity, and just to let emotions out. So prioritize relationship and reconnection over training. I mentioned it. That's a very good time to be people-oriented, relationship-oriented, rather than performance-oriented. Of course, we'll need to be adaptable, and we'll need to follow public health guidelines. And that's an important part of returning to train. Training center will eventually reopen, and there'll be a lot of rules, a lot of regulation to follow. Expect that, of course, and inform yourself about those rules and those guidelines, because athletes will turn to you to answer questions and to be a model. So you'll have to role model the behaviors you want your athletes to have, and in terms of public health rules and guidelines. Share that information and use facts. Avoid opinions, avoid impressions. Make sure you share the right information with your athletes, and help them visualize their new training environment, or what they'll have to adapt to. So if you have the chance to access your training facility before your athletes, you could use videos, you could use pictures or other visuals to send to your athletes, so that they know what to expect when they get into their training facility. That will be a good way to manage anxiety and novelty for them. All right, second phase, keyword is reality. We will need to measure, we'll need to track, we'll need to test. Athletes have done different things. They have followed their training plan differently during confinement. Some of them were training almost as usual. Others took a break. So they're at different places in terms of their physical, their mental, and their technical, tactical skills. So we'll need to measure. We'll need to know exactly where they start. So make sure to collaborate with your IST members, team members, and make sure that we set realistic goals. As I mentioned earlier, we need to start where we're at, not where we would like to be. Usually when I work with athletes and coaches to set goals, I do it this way. We start with outcome goals. For example, this competition, this is what I want to achieve, and then we ask the question, okay, how am I going to achieve this? So we set long-term, mid-term, short-term goals, and we get into process goals, or even daily or training goals. However, at this point, most of you don't even know if you'll have competition this year, when you'll have competition. So I suggest that we work the other way around. Let's start with daily actions. So what are your athletes doing every day right now? At what point, at what starting point are they? So let's start with everyday actions and then set short-term goals. Okay, let's work on that. Let's improve that. So short-term goals, midpoint, long-term, and eventually when we'll have more information, then we can set outcome goals. So that's another way to be adaptable in our goal setting. Couple of tips for the second phase: return to training gradually. Slowly, gradually. These are very important keywords. Slow progress, steady progress, to make sure that we don't overtrain or we don't create injuries. Imagine an athlete that develops an injury and has to stop training after just a couple of weeks of having started training. That's very disappointing, right? So we don't want to create that disappointment. Of course, we'll need to be creative in our goals, in our plans. Please plan breaks. Confinement, isolation was not a break for most of your athletes. Just the mental load of, having to adapt to uncertainty, having to change your habits. As I mentioned, some of them might be more impacted by the situation than others. So let's not consider the last couple of weeks as a break. That was not a break. Let's keep working on building skills, mental skills, recovery strategies, tactical skills, not only physical and technical skills. Most of us will have to remain on the internet for a while. So let's keep that connection that we built through virtual meetings. Let's not stop that just yet. And then we move on to the third phase, the putting into action our plan, our goals. And the key word, as I mentioned, is resilience here. There are two ways to go through this positively. The first way is to adapt, which means to return to a previous state. So return to at the point we were at before confinement. And that's fine. We might want to return to that point. But let's consider another option as well. Let's consider transformation. Find ourselves in a better state than before. Transform ourselves, do things differently. Give yourself the permission to debrief and to reflect with your athletes. What do we want to change? I mean, yes, we're returning to training, but we don't have to return to the exact same way of doing things. We might want to change some things. So let's give ourselves that permission to think about what we'd like to do to get even better. And what we want to avoid is to have a negative experience of returning to training. As I mentioned, for example, developing an injury only after a few weeks of returning. That would be an example of a negative experience. Couple of tips for that last phase. Identify lessons learned, and you can do that through storytelling. Storytelling is very powerful. Let your athletes talk about their confinement stories, their return to training stories, their flops, but also their successes. Ask them what they're proud of through that whole experience. And you can even use that to build your team culture. Make sure you use the resources and expertise of your IST team. Get them involved on all the way through all those phases. Trust the process. There's no shortcut here. We're not going to be as fast as we want to be or we want to go, but we need to respect the process and to respect the rhythm of each athlete. Stick to facts and science. We mentioned that before. Measure, test. That will be very important. Celebrate successes. That will be so important. Recognize that your whole IST team, your whole team worked hard through this whole situation. So that's important to celebrate and to honor. Let's not fall back into old habits. As I mentioned, we could go back to what we were before, but we could also give ourselves permission to do things differently. So if there are things that we were not so happy about in our coaching, let's change that. Let's use our lesson learned to transform ourselves. All right. So those were a couple of guidelines, and I'd like to discuss those with Pat Côté.
Well, thanks, Amélie, for this presentation. Lots of golden nuggets that I'm writing down right now, and you actually started to answer a lot of the questions I had, so that's I think that's great. I'm gonna start by taking you back to that emotional stage, that especially regarding the coach empathy. What tools would you suggest, or how can a coach get the athletes to open up? Maybe just before we resume training or as we resume training, so that we better understand their emotional state.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would suggest that the first thing is to create a context where the athlete will be able to open up. Could be having an individual conversation. Could be putting the table, like sharing some of your experience, normalizing experience as well, normalizing feelings. It's okay, it's normal to feel anxious about returning. It's okay to have expectancies. It's okay to have fears. So normalizing is very important here. All emotions are valid. There's no good or bad emotions, and if coaches are willing to show their own emotion, to show a little bit of vulnerability and share their own experience, I think that will help athletes to open up.
Oh, thanks for that.
I think if it's okay with you, Pat, I'll stop sharing my presentation so people can see our faces.
Perfect.
Where is it? Oh, here it is. There we go. Go ahead.
I guess my second question for you, being a team sport coach, I'm expecting a very broad spectrum of emotions or anxiety level where the athletes will be at. Some will have that fear. You know how you went to the 4 types of athletes going back, excited to be there, fearing to be there, don't care, or those that were actually impacted. How can we deal with those different ranges of anxiety within a training group or within the team?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. because of course your different athletes within the same team will have different emotions. I think it will be very important to making athletes understand that they are in different emotional states. Empathy is true for coaches, but it's also true for athletes. They'll need to show empathy to their teammates. And having that open conversation with the team, I think, could be a good way to start. And I think another way to do is to individualize your intervention. I don't know. I think it's through personal relationship. It's through conversation, and within the team, making sure that it's empathy is the key word with teammates as well.
Yeah, no, I fully agree, and I believe a lot in those individual connections, visual relationships with the athletes. But as a coach in a team environment or training group environment, I think it's also important to understand the impact that different team members will have on others, especially in a team sports context where peer pressure might start to be applied, consciously or not. And I guess that's where I was coming from with my question: how to develop that awareness in those that by their actions or by what they're saying might create that pressure, therefore increase the anxiety level for athletes that are seeing the world differently and might be more anxious about their return to training. So finding that balance, because it's not that one's more right than the other, but they still need to figure out how to work together.
Yeah, and maybe, as I mentioned, having that conversation with the whole team and making them understand the impact that they have on their teammate and the impact of what they say and to their teammates. I think that could be a start. I have a question for our attendants. I think we have a poll question about if you're from an individual or a collective sport. We'll have an answer. Oh, it's about almost half.
It's
cool. Excellent, almost half. And Pat, I had a question regarding the collective way of dealing with that situation. I was wondering how did you maintain your team cohesion through confinement, and how do you plan on working on your team dynamics when you get back to training?
Yeah, what we've been doing, it's been progressive, and we went from full team interactions at the very get-go, so that we had clarity of messaging with the athletes and staff, and then we went straight into individual connections. So me calling everybody individually on a regular basis, on a weekly basis, casual, unstructured conversations. Some would go wheelchair rugby for an hour. Others would just go about life and the current situation. So it was more about making sure that people were fine, and that if flags were raised, that we would put the proper resources around people. As we advanced, we started to shift a little bit more to training in a virtual context. So we started to do some small groups, tactical meetings. We're using video, or I'm sending them rugby homeworks that we discussed together. And the group size varies from 3 people, 3 athletes and myself, to the next day it might be the full team together. So we're trying to be creative and use different tools to stimulate the athletes, create learning opportunities that we usually don't have because we're face to face in one regular environment. So we've been trying different things. So we've been doing that for probably 6 weeks now, and alongside we keep on having those bigger groups meeting with. I was muted for a second. We had one around mental prep or dealing with the COVID situation. We have one schedule around periodization, training planning, just so we enhance athletes' understanding of what training phases and what's expected of them in the home-based training. We had some just for connecting and having fun. And again, in parallel to that, I'm ongoingly connecting with everybody on an individual basis. Again, some are structured and are going to be tailored toward a specific topic, and others are more casual conversations. Mm-hmm. As we start to get back to training, I'm seeing probably a lot of those virtual connections to continue to take place because we're centralized across the country and we're likely not going to be together for another few months. Therefore, even though they will be training in their training groups, it's going to be important to keep the full team connected together, probably continuing on what we've been doing. And again, I think creativity is super important here. Finding new ways, new topics, or new ideas to keep people engaged and interested.
Mm-hmm. Virtual meetings, well, we discovered them, and we discovered that virtual meetings were really good to get to know our teammates from a different angle, from a different perspective. And we, in other sports I'm working with, we also use virtual meetings to work on team values. So discuss our team values. How do we put into action those values when we're back to training, and what kind of behaviors we want to see on the training court. So yeah, why not continue with that? That's a good point.
Yeah. No, I think it's going to be super important to not necessarily just revert back to what we used to do when we can return to training, but as you suggested, maybe reinvent ourselves a little bit. Basically, not forget about the good things that we've been doing for the last few months.
Mm-hmm. Pat, we know that some para-athletes might be at higher risk of complication if they get infected by the virus. How is this risk impacting your plans for the return?
Well, it's the first thing is it's a topic we don't know a lot about, so there's lots of uncertainty. The science is very limited, no evidence that it would impact our athletes differently, but at the same time, common sense points us in that direction. So since there is no evidence, we need to be super cautious. Our approach has been to take it super slow. Again, I guess it goes back to what you were suggesting earlier. But as everybody returns, we don't need to be eager to be the first one at the door at one of the COPSIN and be ready to go. We're actually going to take a step back and observe and watch different other sports or the overall system go through that first phase of return to play, and see what it means for our athletes. Are we safe? Is it gonna be everybody returning at the same time, or is it going to be a staggered approach where athletes with lower risk can probably return to a safe training prior to athletes that would have underlying health conditions or level of disability that would put them at a higher risk? Key to that, I think, is also we've been communicating that to our group since the beginning. We've been super clear that the athlete personally will be at the forefront of their personal decision. Am I going back to training or not? Do I feel safe with the different mitigation strategies that are going to be put in place or not? So we want to be having that constant chat with our athletes. This is what the environment is going to look like. Those are the measures in place. That's how we minimize the risk. Are you comfortable knowing what we know based on your specific condition? And we've been clear that we will be okay with different level of participations at the beginning until things are safe for everybody to resume normal training. So that's how we've been dealing with the issue. But obviously, people's health it's the first thing we consider. That being mentioned, Emily, I had a question around motivation. Again, different anxiety level, fear for some. Some may start right away, others may start a little later. And then you have the uncertainty regarding the competition schedule. Right now, we don't have nothing scheduled until end of June next year, officially. How do we motivate athletes in their return to training? I know you touched on the reverse goal process, which goal setting process, which I took a few notes. But beyond that, what are the tools we have as coaches to make sure that we're lighting that fire for our athletes?
That's a really good question, and that's a main challenge to get the passion going, get the motivation going. I think the tools to ignite the motivation is the motivation itself. There are different types of motivation, and there are different and those different types of motivation we can use as leverage or as tools. The first one we think about is to tap into the intrinsic motivation, into the passion, into the pleasure. Let's put pleasure into training. Let's put fun into training. Exactly. Let's make our training sessions fun, and use that fun through games, through connection. It's not just about work. It's about having fun, doing what we love, and getting back at it. So that could be one tool. That could be one thing to get motivated. Another type of motivation is extrinsic motivation, and we could do challenges. Get into competition, organize simulated matches or competition. Even if it's not an official competition, let's organize, a competition with another club, another team, maybe even another country. That could be totally unofficial. So that will motivate our athletes that are more result oriented, and they need to get into that competitive state of mind to be motivated. So that could be something. We could even organize challenges within the team, between teammates, that could help some of our athletes as well. And the other one is to, well, we could use long-term goals and we could use short-term goals. Some athletes will be very motivated to think about their long-term goal, to think about their dream. So let's picture that, let's visualize that, let's talk about that, either individually or with the team. And some athletes will need to be more on the short term. So let's stay in the present moment. Let's set training goals that will be more motivating for them. So everybody is different, but we do have different types of motivation that we can use as leverage. So let's use the whole range.
I like the idea of, well, the creating a fun environment, obviously, but also triggering that competitors inside our athletes. Still around the topic of uncertainty moving forward, how can we help our athletes or staff or even ourselves really focus on what we can control and not be distracted by all the noise that's happening around COVID-19?
Because there will be noise, for sure.
There's lots of noise.
Already,
Daily.
yes. Exactly. I think the main tip I could give is to make sure that we send a message to our athletes not to compare themselves. Realities are different. Rules are different from a country to another, even from a province to another one, even from a city from another one. So let's not compare. Let's work with what we have. Let's work with our reality. So this is our plan. This is what we decided we would do. Or even for the individual, this is your plan. This is your goal. It might be different than your teammates, but don't compare. You guys have different experiences, and that's okay. You'll have different goals, of course. So let's focus on ourselves, and let's do things as we want to do them. Everybody will do different things. Everybody will have different strategies to get back to performance. We have chosen to do this strategy. This is our plan as a team. Let's trust that. Let's focus on that. Let's not look at what is the neighbors doing, right? So I think that's a message we need to send to the team.
No, I agree that clear messaging here is key. Trusting our plan, our strategy, but doesn't it hold true until we see that our main competitor is in full-on training camp and we're still back home training? Can that create lots of bring us back to that emotional state, couldn't it?
Yeah, definitely, because it will create anxiety. It already does anyway for some athletes. Yeah. So yes, it might bring us back to the emotional phase, and we'll need to go back to that phase and to talk about that anxiety. You know, what do we fear? Do we fear we're not fast enough? Do we fear we're not strong enough? Do we fear that we're not up to expectancies? What's the fear behind that anxiety, behind that comparison? So we'll need to have this conversation. It might bring us back to phase one. Yeah, exactly. And I would say get help from your MPC.
No, totally. I think we have Kara back.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering if you have some time for me to ask some of the questions that are coming in on the Q&A, if you're close to answering your questions.
Definitely.
Sure.
Ready?
Yeah.
Okay, so here is one. How do you suggest approaching return to training if many clubs and businesses are permanently closed? What if athletes can't afford to resume training?
If you want to go ahead, Pat.
Oh, that's a very good and tough question that goes to
Yeah.
your category of athletes that were directly impacted by the situation. Uh, I guess we're privileged. It's not something that we're gonna have to face with a national team program, but when it comes to club, I think our strategy of just approaching it individually, so putting the participant or the athlete at the forefront of the decision making, and making sure that everybody's comfortable with when, how they will return to training would be my position. There's no clear position to be at for a club or for a team. But I'll let Amélie chip in.
Okay.
That brings another discussion, I think, with the athletes that might not be able to resume training. It brings the question of what's the next step for you? If it's not training, what could it be? And if it is still training, how can we make it happen? Crowdfunding, either, there are many different things. We could be creative here, but it could also bring, a reflection on what's the next step for me. So there'll be athletes who will transition out of sport. We have to be ready for that as well. So
it's difficult.
Yeah, it is.
Excuse me, how can we set up games and competitions in a contact sport when, for example, in hockey, even on the ice, we must maintain social distancing? Do you guys have any ideas?
Well, we're a contact sport, so it's not something I have fully figured out the answer yet. Participation will be, for the time being, dictated by provincial or local authorities' guidelines. As long as we cannot be in close space or enter in contact with each other, well, the sport as we know it, we won't be able to play it. Therefore, our approach has been to be creative in developing other skills. So in our context, everything that we're going to do for the time being is going to be about ball handling and chair skills. So working on those things, seizing the opportunity to really work on those things, and be fully ready, probably better than we were before in those areas, when we can progress to more regular technical, tactical work. But there's just no way we can create an environment where we can play our regular sport with contact at this point, and we need to respect that. The other way to look at it would be to bring the full team in one area, once permitted, obviously, quarantine there, create a bubble, and then have people play the regular sport. So 2 ways to approach it, but that second approach, logistically super complicated, financially as well. But I challenge myself, I challenge all coaches to actually be creative and figure out ways to create drills or small games to develop other skills within their sports during this time.
Good. Next question. Our season ramps up near tournaments and championships. It then dips to recovery during phase and then ramps up again before the next competition. My question is, should we not try to mimic ramping up contact and interaction, and then recover with less contact and interaction while we're in isolation?
That's a very good question, and not knowing how long we will be in this confinement or until we can resume team training. Uh, Very tough to answer. I would suggest probably yes. We need at some point ramp things up, bring into some type of intensity into training so that we cycle. We basically periodize the training load during confinement again, so that we're ready. We're better ready once we come back. Other things to reflect on, again, not knowing when we're going to be back in action. How do we program the training load so that when we resume, we're minimizing the risk of injury on the athletes? That's especially true for running. Well, it's true for all sports, but running sports, jumping sports, and contact sports, knowing that we won't have those contacts for an extended period of time. So it needs to be programmed super carefully. So cycling through different training loads is one way to do that. Obviously, we're limited to equipment access or training setup available during confinement. So that's a limiter to take into consideration. Again, I defer back to strength and conditioning professionals or team physiologists to help coaches with that planning.
That's great. What is the best way to deal with anxiety and fear that might be coming from parents?
Oh.
That's a very good question. I would definitely ask if there is fear and anxiety coming from parents. If I were a coach, I would connect with those parents, with my athletes' parents, and have that conversation. Why not organizing a Zoom meeting with the parents before resuming to training, and to get a pulse of, how they feel, what's their mindset. I would have that open conversation. What do they fear, and what's their mindset? Are they resistant to send their kids to training? Have the family been impacted, or they're just happy to be back? So I would definitely have that conversation.
Okay, we're just a bit over time, but there's one really good question left. So we're gonna try with this one more before wrapping things up. So I'm coaching a basketball girls team at the Cégep level. Our season ended before conference and provincial champs. This had an impact emotionally on most of the players. On returning, I will have to do a selection because I have too many players. How can I deal with this situation without providing another negative sport experience to the players I will be cutting?
That's a very, very good question. Again, I'm going back to my approach of putting the athletes at the forefront. So engaging during this period with every athlete individually, having them to open up and share emotions about previous season, frustrations about not finishing the season, maybe frustrations about not knowing or not seeing where they're going to fit in the future within the program. And at the same time, seizing the opportunity as a coach to provide clarity, explaining that you'll have to select a team, that no spots are secured, or so basically managing expectations. But well, you know, that empathy that goes both ways, having the athlete understand what you're going through as a coach and the reality that, example, you have 20 athletes and you're going to have to select 12. How you're planning on making your decisions, what are going to be your rationals, providing as much information as you can, as much clarity as you can to the athlete, so that they can, well, decide on what they're going to do, what they will control in order to make the team, or maybe just understand that it's not going to be for them next time around. So that would be my approach. But again, I'm curious to hear Emily here.
Pat's approach is exactly what I would have suggested. Making sure that the athletes understand that this is the process. I mean, there's a selection. This is how it works, and there's no place secure. Everybody will have to go through this, and it's the end result will be that we need to cut people, unfortunately. It doesn't really change from another start of a season, but what changes is providing the place and space to talk about their experience, what they have experienced in confinement, the disappointment, or the excitement to be back. Just provide that space, make sure that, you know, they understand that yes, it's a different context, but the process of selection is pretty much the same as usual, unfortunately.
If I don't know if we still have time, but if I can make the parallel, we had just qualified for the Paralympics the week before basically the country went on lockdown. Now the game were pushed a year, so it's clear for all athletes involved, well, the program is qualified, but we're going to need to pick a team. So very similar situation. And I'm trying, with all this uncertainty that we have right now, to provide as much clarity to our athletes. This is how we're going to be selecting the team. This is probably when we're going to be selecting the team. Those are going to be the opportunities for you from now to that point. But right now, this is what you can control to make my job as hard as it can be, or actually make it easy, make it super clear that you're the one I'm going to be picking. So that's kind of how I try to frame it for the athletes. Obviously, at the end of the day, 12 will be selected, and some athletes will be disappointed, but that's the nature of high performance sport.
Yeah, it's pretty hard to, like, that's just a tough position, right? Selection's always a tough issue. So there's not a great outcome for the people that are being cut, but there is a way to try and be as transparent as possible going into it, so everybody knows what to expect. So I'm gonna wrap this up. Unfortunately, we've gone a few minutes over, so there's probably still some questions that we didn't get to, but we will stick to the schedule here. I want to thank both Patrick and Emily. It's been a really interesting conversation. I know it's on all of our minds, all of us in sport, as we prepare for the athletes to slowly enter back to training. So thank you very much. To all the participants, you will be receiving a feedback survey after this. So if you could please take a moment to fill it out, we greatly appreciate, and we do review your responses. So on that note, I will wish everyone a good day, and look forward to our next topic here, our next webinar, Mindful Monday, which will be, I believe, in 2 weeks. Anyways, watch your emails. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.